Welcome, I'm Jon Caldara, president of the Independence Institute and your devil's advocate. Later in the program, we're going to look at something called the Blaine Amendment. Sounds boring, but it affects 38 states. But first, how do you choose to die? Do you believe that we have the death penalty in Colorado? Yeah, we do. It just rarely gets used. Michael Radelet, thank you for being here. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
I want to introduce this book, The History of the Death Penalty in Colorado. Now, this is a book, right?
I don't think there'll be a second edition.
You don't think so?
No.
How many people have been put to death in Colorado?
Since 1859, 103.
And how is that compared to other states?
Some states really go to town and execute a lot. States like Texas, most of the states of the southern of the Confederacy. Most executions today are in the South. But Colorado is relatively rare. We've de facto abolitionists. We haven't had an execution since 1997. And before that, the previous one was 1967. So
they're rare.
Yeah, we've had two executions in the last 50 years.
By contrast, Texas.
Texas is 560 since about 1980. They started in the current era.
All right, now this fascinates me. One, that you would study this issue, but it's not just in Colorado. When you were a professor down in Florida, you spent time with death row inmates on the eve of their execution.
Yes.
This seems like grim work.
It's grim in one way. In another way, their stories are fascinating. We can learn a lot from these people, learn a lot from these families. So I have to say that after moving to Colorado in 2001, there are times when I miss it. I was down in Miami a couple weeks ago with former death row inmates. They have a geriatric prison. It's really bizarre. A bunch of old people in wheelchairs walking around with poles.
It's called the VA.
Yeah, right. Yeah. It must be. I mean, the average age of the prisoners is over 70. So one really gets a feeling about what the alternative to the death penalty is, and that's life without parole.
So why would these guys let you in to hang out with them the evening before they lose their life?
A couple of reasons. One is the attorneys had asked me to go and be with them. The attorneys were in court. Attorneys don't really like the hands-on working with death row inmates, so they were looking for somebody just to be with the guy, deliver messages, notarize papers, be with the family, things like that.
I mean, did you have some sort of therapeutic role in being there? So you're there as a scholar, as an academic, right?
I think I'm more there just as a person. I wasn't doing research on those people. I have written on families of death row inmates, but my work with death row inmates themselves and going through last visits, I've never really written that up. I consider it confidential. I don't know if it's legally confidential, but I never have really told those stories.
What binds them all together? You've seen, this blows my mind. You've done this 50 times.
What binds them together, very interesting. It's mostly, not all. A lot of them say, look, I'm happy to get out of here. The best I can hope for is life without parole. I hate this place, and my misery will be over tomorrow morning when they kill me. But then they say, take care of my family. You know, you and I can always think about our deaths. We can anticipate it. Would you rather die in a car crash or have a heart attack, that kind of stuff. But we don't reflect on it. We don't look back on it. And the families of the death row inmates look back on it. They experience the stigma. Their pain is usually isolated. They might not be able to tell people with whom they work, their neighbors, people at church, you know, what they're going through. So it's the families that I think the difference between life without parole and the death penalty is the different impact of the death penalty is felt more by the family than by the inmate.
You've been through this 50 times. Were any of these people not guilty?
Well, who knows? There were some who
From your point of view.
I would say there are some who had plausible cases of innocence. That's about as far as I go. There's one guy, Jesse Tefero, executed May 3rd, 1990. He burned to death in the electric chair. His mother was sitting on the couch on one side of me. Sister Helen Prejean, who wrote Dead Man Walking, was on the other side. My wife is there. And we heard on the radio that he burned to death. The national publicity from that execution was read by his co-defendant's childhood friend. His co-defendant was his common law wife. That friend was a film producer in Boston. She came down, reunited with a friend, did a movie about the case, found all sorts of exculpatory evidence that the prosecutor had not turned over, and lo and behold, 2 years later, that co-defendant, Sonia Jacobs, walked. She now lives in Galway, Ireland. So Jesse was convicted on the same evidence. There was a third guy involved. He got to the cops first, agreed to a life term if he testified against the other two. And so, you know.
How are most executions done? Isn't it lethal injection? Isn't that the preferred method today?
Well, preferred. It depends on who's doing the preferring, but it's the most common. Until
why is it the most common?
Up until about 2000, the most common method was the electric chair. Actually, in 1972, the Supreme Court threw out the death penalty. So we talk about the modern era as after 1972. And there have been 5 methods that we've used: hanging, gas chamber, the electric chair, lethal injection, and did I say gas chamber?
Firing squad?
Firing squad. There have been 2 people in Utah executed by the firing squad.
If you had to choose one, which of those 5 would you choose for yourself? Because you've seen this, so.
Yeah, I suppose, you know, you can't beat the firing squad.
Think that would be the most merciful?
It's hard to find that out because you can't really interview the person after it's happened. But they say you don't even hear the gunshot. I don't know. Lethal injection, there's all sorts of problems. You know, it's like giving blood. If you're obese or you have bad veins, a lot of these guys have been drug addicts. Sometimes it takes half hour, 45 minutes to find a vein. And if you look on the web with my name and botched executions, you'll find a list of 50 botched executions where it takes a lot of time to find a good vein.
It doesn't take great detective work for me to say, you are obviously not a fan of the death penalty.
That's correct.
All right. Were you always this way?
I was really ambivalent until I started seeing what was going on, seeing the disparities, seeing the impact on the family. And then in the 1980s, I started doing research on erroneous convictions. So those are the issues that turn my mind, even though, you know, I'm Catholic. And when I was a kid, all those people we prayed to had been executed. You know, so that issue of morality is one that also affects my view.
So help me out with this. You go from agnostic,
yeah.
and this is such an incredibly debatable topic.
Sure.
I find myself torn on this.
Sure.
Because I think it's a punishment that fits the crime. At the same time, I worry about a state that has the power to take people's lives and how that can be abused. And we've seen throughout history how governments abuse that power. You talk about cases that went wrong and the guy was proved innocent too late. But what switched you from here to over to there? What was the one thing? What was the time that said, enough, I can't take this anymore?
I think George Will summarizes it the best. He said, let's not forget that the death penalty is a government program, and as such, it's filled with government imperfections. And I started doing research on race, and it's not the race of the defendant, but the race of the victim that has very strong predictive power in who's sentenced to death. All other things being equal, you're between 3 and 4 times more likely to be sentenced to death if you kill a white victim than if you kill a black victim. So that was the first thing. It's not applied equitably, and a conservative argument is that, you know, governments make mistakes. A second conservative argument is basically religious, and if we surveyed religious leaders in the state of Colorado today, I'll bet 90% would stand opposed to the death penalty. And then the third one that probably will drive the death penalty in the next couple of decades is the cost. It just costs wheelbarrows filled with money.
Let's work backwards on
Sure.
some of those. Cost. It's cost because we have endless appeal after endless appeal. My guess is it's a whole lot cheaper in Texas.
The appeals in Texas are more quick, and it's cheap in Texas because they don't provide adequate public defenders. Here in Colorado, we've got great representation, so that's part of it. But the trial costs are only a small part of the cost of the death penalty. Most of it is built in appeals. And across the country, last year, of the people executed, the average time on death row was 19 years. The year before that, it was closer to 30 years. So it's lots of time on death row.
But it's going in the right direction. My guess is if it didn't cost much, and if it happened quickly, you would still be, and most people would still be greatly opposed to it.
Well, you know, if cows can fly, should we build airports? I mean, who knows?
Yeah.
It would be a different world. The lawyers are not going away.
And that's the reason for the death penalty right there.
Yeah, really.
All right. Talk to me a little bit about Colorado. In the cover, you've got this remarkable picture. It's the gas chamber.
Yes.
And Colorado used this very gas chamber. Where is it?
It's down in the entrance to the prison museum in Canyon City. You can go down, you can look at it. There's a little chain across the door, but you can, if you ask one of the guides at the museum, they'll take the chain off. You can walk through it. It's very impressive. I've been deterred.
Yeah. I mean, the recidivism rate is really impressive when it comes to the death penalty.
Yeah, but of course, that doesn't count the kids and the family members who are devastated by the loss of their loved one. The family is destructed, and the kids go on and can commit some pretty bad crimes. Let me say one thing about Colorado. We've had a history in this state, really unlike any other, of a search for a more humane execution method. That's going on now with lethal injection and all the litigation about whether or not the drugs are good or bad or whatever. But in Colorado, that goes back to the 1890s when we first started to hang people in Canyon City. Before that, they were all done in counties. 1888, we had 18,000 people at a hanging here in Denver.
18,000 people?
18,000, 6, 7, 8,000. Big crowds, especially in Leadville. I guess not much else going on in Leadville, but they were really dramatic events.
Stop for a second.
Yeah.
Public executions. I mean, when I think back on folklore, it is always a public execution because it has the most deterrent effect when you do it in public. That's not done anymore.
Right.
When was the last time that happened?
1937 in Kentucky, Owensboro, Kentucky. Ramey Bethia was the guy's name. 600 or 700 people showed up. And during those public execution, the rumor is, I mean, who knows if it's true, but the rumor was that pickpockets would show up and, all sorts of crimes were taking place. But you're right, the families would bring their kids, the teachers there'd be no school. They were all on Friday to commemorate, I guess, the day that we thought Jesus was crucified. But teachers would bring their students and, Johnny, if you don't do your homework, this is what's going to happen to you. And there was a choir, long, elaborate ceremony. The guy would go up there and talk for as long as he could, denouncing alcohol, women, drugs, everything else, proclaiming his innocence. And then the trapdoor would open and you drop. But there were so many botched executions that when they went to the prison in 1890, they went to the prison in 1890 because the crowds were so unruly. So they just said, enough, we're moving down to Canyon City. Then they developed this thing in Colorado where the guy was no longer dropped through the trap door. They had a big horizontal beam up on top of the guy with 2 pulleys. On one end was the guy with the rope around his neck. On the other end was a weight. They started with 200 pounds in 1890, and by the time they got rid of it in 1930, there were 800 pounds. And the weight would drop, the guy would go up. Headlines, "Jerk to Jesus, launch to eternity," this kind of stuff, and the crowd would be enthralled. Then there was a really bad botched execution in 1928, a guy, Eddie Ives, who had killed a cop here in Denver, and they had to hang him twice. The rope got twirled up on the pulley, ka-clunk, so they had to do it again. And because of that, we switched to what was then the newest, most efficient method, the gas chamber. Colorado became the second state in the country to adopt the gas chamber. And we used that all the way up through 1967, when Colorado hosted the last execution in the United States in that era. There was a 10-year moratorium after that, no more executions.
All right, last prediction here. I think we've got 3 people on death row. One of them is Nathan Dunlap, who Hickenlooper has given a temporary reprieve from, which seems cruel in every direction. I think by the time Hickenlooper leaves office, that turns into a permanent reprieve, especially if he's followed by a Republican who will follow that out. This is an issue that I don't think is going to go away. Over time, I think more and more states get rid of the death penalty. I'm not editorializing on that, but that's my guess.
Well, it certainly happened in the last 10 years. There have been all sorts of states that have gotten rid of the death penalty. New York, New Jersey, Maryland, Illinois, Nebraska got rid of it last year. I mean, call them what you will, but don't call them liberal.
Michael, we got to run.
Brought it back.
Thank you. I hope you never have to witness me in this. Stay tuned.